They called my property and blight on their pristine community and demanded I conform or leave. 6 months later, they discovered I was the retired district attorney who had prosecuted organized crime for 25 years. I'm sitting here in what remains of my workshop, where the acrid smell of melted plastic still haunts the air like a toxic memory. You can see daylight through the twisted metal framework that once supported my greenhouse roof. Broken glass sparkles under my work boots as I survey the destruction. Shards from windows that used to catch the morning light filtering through oak trees I'll never see bloom again. The surveillance recordings tell the whole story. There's Margaret Thornfield, chairwoman of the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Council, orchestrating what she termed emergency hazard removal for community safety. Interesting how safety emergencies always seem to target properties that inconvenience certain people. But they made one fatal miscalculation when they decided to escalate beyond intimidation. They never bothered to research who they were threatening. What would you do if your homeowners association tried to systematically destroy your life? Share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how many fellow property owners are dealing with similar battles. Let me rewind 8 months to when life felt manageable and I still had faith in people's basic decency. My name is Catherine Walsh, Kate to those who know me well, and I'm 61 years old with enough courtroom victories to fill a small library. I had recently retired after 25 years as a district attorney, trading my prosecutorial briefcase for gardening gloves and the dream of peaceful retirement on my late aunt's 3-acre homestead in Millbrook Township, Oregon, where morning fog rolls through ancient fir trees like nature's own meditation practice. The property had belonged to our family since 1947, decades before anyone conceived of architectural review boards or landscape compliance standards. I'd spent the previous year converting Aunt Rose's modest farmhouse into an artist's retreat, complete with a pottery studio, organic vegetable gardens, and native plant restoration areas that any ecologist would admire. That's when Margaret Thornfield descended upon my world, like a perfectly coordinated natural disaster. Maggie was 55 years old with razor-sharp silver hair that broadcast, "I supervise everything within a 5-mile radius." She'd arrived in our township 4 years earlier, fresh from a corporate restructuring that left her with a hefty severance package and enough controlling instincts to micromanage a small nation. Within 8 months, she'd positioned herself as the elected chair of the newly formed Oakwood Heights Homeowners Council that had materialized around the established rural properties like bureaucratic ivy climbing old-growth trees. The sound of her luxury sedan's engine preceded her arrival that first autumn morning, followed by the click of sensible heels on my flagstone walkway. "You must be the non-compliant resident," she announced, emerging from her vehicle with a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly groceries. Her smile carried all the warmth of a tax audit. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, chairwoman of the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Council." I set down my pruning shears, having just finished trimming my heritage apple trees. "Catherine Walsh, pleased to meet you. Though I should mention that my property has been in continuous family ownership since before your organization existed." Her gaze swept across my land like a quality control inspector examining a defective product. "Nevertheless, we need to address several aesthetic violations that impact community standards." I couldn't suppress a chuckle. "Ma'am, this property predates your homeowners council by 40 years. I have the original deed if you'd care to examine it." Her confident expression flickered momentarily before reconstructing itself. "We'll see about that, Ms. Walsh." The sound of her heels striking my walkway as she retreated should have warned me of what was coming. But I was still thinking like a prosecutor, assuming people would respect legal precedent and due process. What I didn't realize was that Margaret Thornfield operated by her own rules, and they had nothing to do with justice. Her consulting firm had recently partnered with Grandview Development Corporation, and my 3 acres of prime township land represented a $4 million commercial development opportunity. All they needed was one stubborn old woman to disappear. Within 2 weeks, anonymous violations began flooding the township offices. Septic system failures that didn't exist, fire code violations that made no sense, agricultural use permits for gardens that had never required permits. Each morning brought another township inspector to my door, each one departing with the same puzzled look and identical conclusion. Everything was completely legal. But Margaret was just beginning her campaign. I detected the scent of manipulation in the changing season air, something calculating and ruthless that had nothing to do with falling leaves. One afternoon, I noticed surveying equipment appearing along my property boundaries, metal stakes driven into the earth like territorial markers. My neighbors assumed I was simply a retired teacher who'd inherited some land, having no clue they were observing a former district attorney preparing for the legal battle of her career. 25 years of prosecuting organized crime and political corruption had trained me to recognize predators, and Margaret Thornfield was positioning herself for the attack. 4 weeks later, Margaret launched her opening assault, and it was beautifully orchestrated. I was hosting my niece's college graduation celebration. Nothing elaborate, just a barbecue and young adults enjoying themselves in the backyard, when a legal courier appeared at my front gate. The timing was deliberately calculated for maximum embarrassment and disruption. Catherine Walsh? The courier appeared uncomfortable, probably because 20-year-old Jessica was watching him with a hamburger halfway to her mouth. You're being served with legal action regarding environmental violations affecting neighborhood water quality. The documents were substantial enough to use as building material, filed by Blackstone, Hartwell & Associates, the type of law firm whose marble lobby tells you exactly how much they charge per consultation. The lawsuit alleged my composting operations were somehow contaminating the entire area's groundwater, which was scientifically absurd since we all relied on separate well systems. But truth rarely factors into harassment campaigns. By the following morning, Channel 12 News was broadcasting the story. Reclusive homeowners' environmental violations threaten community health. The reporter somehow made my rain gardens and composting bins sound like environmental terrorism against innocent families. I had to appreciate Margaret's media strategy. She'd transformed conservation into contamination in less than 24 hours. But here's what nobody understood. I hadn't survived 25 years prosecuting organized crime by surrendering to intimidation tactics. While Margaret was busy orchestrating media manipulation, I was doing what I do best, building cases. A few conversations with former courthouse colleagues revealed that Margaret Thornfield had been investigated twice by the State Business Licensing Board for fraudulent consulting practices. Her development partner, Grandview Corporation, maintained questionable connections to the Township Planning Commission through a network of family relationships that would impress a genealogy researcher. Most revealing of all, a straightforward public records request exposed financial discrepancies in the homeowners' council accounts. Nearly $300,000 in unexplained expenditures over the past 2 years. I filed my countersuit that same week, alleging systematic harassment, libel, and demanding complete transparency of council finances. Years of watching intimidated witnesses taught me that bullies typically crumble when confronted with genuine legal consequences, especially when they're suddenly responsible for your legal expenses. Through my prosecutorial network, I arranged for the case to be assigned to Judge Harrison, who maintained a well-deserved reputation for intolerance toward frivolous litigation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, and Hartwell arrived with the arrogance of someone expecting to overwhelm some naive rural property owner. He'd prepared an impressive array of legal theatrics and a patronizing demeanor that probably worked effectively on intimidated homeowners. What he hadn't anticipated was confronting someone who'd constructed more legal arguments than Hartwell had likely encountered in his entire practice. I appeared with full prosecutorial presence, the kind of quiet confidence that comes from 25 years commanding district courtrooms. My legal briefs were flawlessly prepared, my evidence systematically organized, and my arguments precise enough to dissect his case like a scalpel. When Judge Harrison inquired about the environmental science supporting the contamination claims, Hartwell's arrogant facade began disintegrating like cheap veneer in a rainstorm. "Your Honor," I said, rising with the measured authority of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. "The plaintiff's allegations contradict basic environmental science. Individual well systems cannot cross-contaminate unless they're accessing the same shallow water table, which geological surveys demonstrate is not applicable here." I presented the hydrogeological assessment I'd commissioned, complete with detailed analysis showing distinct water sources for each property. The courtroom's polished floors echoed with the sound of Hartwell's confidence collapsing. Judge Harrison dismissed Margaret's lawsuit with prejudice and awarded me complete legal costs, nearly $22,000 that would come directly from Margaret's accounts. The expression on Hartwell's face was priceless. "You didn't inform me she was an attorney," he whispered harshly to Margaret as they gathered their materials. But the real confrontation occurred in the courthouse parking area. Margaret was waiting beside my vehicle, her perfectly maintained composure finally fracturing. "You think you're clever with your legal manipulations?" she hissed, pointing an accusatory finger at my chest. The late afternoon sunlight reflected off her expensive watch, probably another trophy from her corporate days. "This isn't finished, Ms. District Attorney. I'll make your existence so unbearable you'll plead to sell that worthless land." She stormed toward her sedan, her heels clicking furiously across the pavement like gunfire in the quiet afternoon. Her tires left dark streaks on the courthouse asphalt that probably violated several municipal codes. I watched her departure with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd just witnessed her opponent reveal her true character in front of security surveillance. 3 weeks following her courthouse humiliation, Margaret decided to experiment with infrastructure sabotage. I awakened one Wednesday morning to discover my water service had been mysteriously interrupted during emergency repairs that nobody had scheduled or announced. The utility company offered profuse apologies, explaining that the council maintenance team had somehow convinced them my lines required immediate disconnection for public safety reasons. Fascinating how public safety crises always seem to occur immediately after you humiliate someone in federal court. But Margaret was just getting started. By Friday, my driveway access was obstructed by emergency roadwork that continued for weeks like some sort of governmental purgatory. The township claimed it was critical infrastructure maintenance, though the surrounding neighborhood's roads remained mysteriously unaffected. Delivery vehicles couldn't reach my property, postal service was suspended, and I had to trek nearly a quarter mile through forest paths just to transport groceries to my front door. The smell of diesel exhaust and hot asphalt became my daily atmosphere, as construction machinery sat motionless for hours, accomplishing nothing except making my life miserable. The culminating insult came when the Department of Environmental Quality appeared investigating anonymous reports about my pottery kiln supposedly releasing toxic emissions into the atmosphere. The inspector was a nervous young man named David Chen who kept avoiding direct eye contact and perspiring through his government-issued shirt. It required exactly 4 minutes of casual conversation to understand why he seemed familiar. He was Margaret's nephew, married to her sister's daughter. Nothing like keeping environmental protection within the extended family. That's when I recalled something my old mentor, Judge Morrison, used to say. "Kate, criminals always create their own evidence trail if you're patient enough to follow the documentation." So I began documenting everything with the systematic precision that had made me legendary. In the district attorney's office, my security system had recorded the council maintenance crew tampering with my water lines at 3 a.m, wearing identical uniforms that probably cost more than most people's weekly income. A basic record search revealed that the road construction had been authorized by Margaret personally without proper township approval or permits. Even better, young David had filed his environmental complaint using his personal email account, which was conveniently connected to the Thornfield family reunion photos on social media platforms. Time to expose the truth publicly. I contacted Jennifer Park, an investigative journalist at Channel 12 who specialized in governmental corruption exposés. Jennifer was sharp as a razor and hungry for a story that would advance her career, particularly one involving homeowner abuse and nepotism. I provided her with a comprehensive evidence package, security footage of utility sabotage, falsified work orders, financial mismanagement documentation, and proof of the environmental agency conflict of interest that would make any ethics attorney celebrate. Within 72 hours, Channel 12 was broadcasting a 4-part investigation titled Council Corruption. Exposed. Jennifer's research revealed that Margaret had been systematically intimidating residents throughout the township, threatening penalties and liens for violations like decorative planters and unauthorized fence colors. One elderly neighbor, Mr. Peterson, broke down during the interview, describing how Margaret had threatened to force the sale of his home over a small herb garden that violated landscape uniformity standards. The story spread through local property rights forums faster than wildfire through dry timber. Suddenly, homeowners' council meeting attendance surged from the typical 6 board members to over 80 furious residents demanding accountability. But Margaret wasn't planning to surrender quietly. She convened an emergency council meeting to address the disinformation campaign being conducted against our community leadership. Standing before the packed township hall, she attempted to modify the council bylaws retroactively to include my property, claiming it was essential to protect everyone's property values from one selfish individual. When several residents observed that retroactive rule modifications were illegal, Margaret produced a petition with 63 signatures supporting the bylaw changes. The only problem, I recognized at least 15 of those signatures as forgeries, having spent years examining fraudulent documents in criminal court. When I challenged the petition's legitimacy, demanding signature verification, Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. "This woman is a dangerous anti-government radical who's been concealing her criminal history from all of you," she screamed, gesturing at me with a trembling hand that revealed her desperation. "She's attempting to destroy our community because she despises law and order." The irony was so dense you could practically taste it. Here was a woman who'd been violating laws systematically, accusing a district attorney of being anti-government. The musty odor of hastily copied legal documents permeated the room as nervous tension crackled through the packed meeting like static electricity before a storm. I smiled and remained silent, understanding that every word she spoke was deepening her legal grave. Following her public breakdown at the council meeting, Margaret decided to escalate to personal destruction warfare. Within days, rumors began circulating through the township like poison in a water supply. Whispered conversations at the local market about how I was supposedly a disgraced prosecutor, hiding from some massive scandal. Anonymous flyers materialized overnight on car windshields and front porches, featuring my photograph with bold text declaring, "Corrupt official living in our community," and encouraging residents to protect your families from this threat. But Margaret made her most serious error when she targeted my family. My son Michael began receiving threatening communications at his Portland law practice, with anonymous voices claiming his mother was a corrupt prosecutor who'd accepted bribes and manipulated cases. The calls were always brief and untraceable, just long enough to plant doubt and anxiety. When I discovered "Crooked DA, go away" spray-painted across my mailbox in angry black letters, the sharp smell of fresh paint mixing with pine air told me we'd crossed from harassment into something much more sinister. The community divided faster than a fault line during an earthquake. Newer residents, mostly Margaret's supporters who'd embraced her property values ideology, avoided eye contact when they encountered me in town. But the longtime residents, families who'd lived here since before the developments, began quietly approaching me with encouragement. Mr. Peterson brought me homemade bread and whispered that he'd never believed the accusations. Sarah Kim, a local contractor, stopped by to repair my mailbox and mentioned that Margaret had cost her a $50,000 project by spreading lies about her work standards. The council meetings became battlegrounds with arguments that could probably be heard in the next township. The smell of fear was stronger than the coffee at those gatherings. That's when I decided to fight back with everything I'd learned in 25 years of public service. I contacted my former colleagues at the State Bureau of Investigation, professionals who'd helped me prosecute cyberstalkers and online harassers. Within a week, they'd traced the anonymous threatening communications to computers at Margaret's consulting office, complete with IP addresses and digital timestamps. From my years handling criminal cases, I understood that documenting everything, with precise timestamps and digital evidence, creates unshakable harassment cases that even the most skilled defense attorneys cannot dispute. Also filed a formal ethics complaint against David Chen, the environmental nephew, for his obvious conflict of interest and abuse of governmental authority. But my secret advantage turned out to be 78-year-old Eleanor Martinez, a retired accountant who'd been quietly documenting council corruption for months. Eleanor had been one of the original council founding members back when it was simply a loose organization to coordinate snow removal and road maintenance. She approached me after one particularly heated meeting, her arms filled with storage boxes that smelled like old paper and determination. "Ms. Walsh," she said, using my professional title for the first time, "I believe you need to examine these." Inside those boxes were copies of every council document since the organization's establishment, including the original charter that specifically exempted pre-existing properties from any future rule modifications. More importantly, Eleanor had been secretly recording council meetings on her tablet for the past year, capturing hours of Margaret's threats, lies, and illegal schemes. To rebuild community relationships and demonstrate I wasn't the antisocial recluse Margaret portrayed me as, I organized weekend gatherings on my property. The first event attracted maybe 15 neighbors, but word spread about good food and honest conversation. By the fourth weekend, we had over 50 people sharing experiences, comparing notes about council harassment, and rediscovering what neighborhood community was supposed to represent. The sound of children's voices mixed with adult discussions and the aroma of grilled food, creating something Margaret's sterile developments could never manufacture: authentic human connection. The crisis point arrived at the next township commissioners' meeting, where Margaret demanded my property be declared a public nuisance that threatened everyone's safety and property values. She'd prepared a digital presentation complete with photographs of my alleged violations, things like compost bins, rain collection barrels, and solar panels that she claimed were aesthetic and health hazards. When my opportunity came to speak, I approached the podium with the measured pace I'd used in criminal courtrooms for 2.5 decades. Commissioners, I think it's time you understood exactly who you're dealing with. I revealed my prosecutorial background for the first time, explaining that I was a retired district attorney who'd spent her career prosecuting corruption and defending citizens' rights. The audience murmur was like wind through evergreen trees, surprised, intrigued, and suddenly very focused. Margaret's face went ashen as she realized she'd been threatening a district attorney for months, but she doubled down with desperate fury. She's still a threat to our property values. Her presence here damages everything we've worked to create. The taste of vindication was sweeter than my morning coffee as I watched her credibility dissolve like sugar in 3 days after the commissioners' meeting. Eleanor Martinez called me with the kind of excitement usually reserved for lottery winners or new grandparents. "Ms. Walsh, you need to come over immediately. I've been reviewing those old recordings and I've discovered something that changes everything." Her voice carried the satisfaction of an accountant who'd just solved a decades-old financial mystery. I drove to her tidy ranch house where she'd transformed her dining room into what resembled a detective's evidence center. Audio equipment covered the table, surrounded by transcripts, financial documents, and timeline charts that would have impressed my old investigation colleagues. The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the dusty scent of old legal papers as Eleanor pulled up an audio file on her computer. "Listen to this," she said, pressing play. Margaret's voice filled the room, crystal clear from a recording made 4 months earlier, during what she thought was a private phone conversation after a council meeting. "Robert, the strategy is working perfectly. Once we force that stubborn old woman out, we'll rezone the entire area for luxury commercial development. Your father's commissioner vote is guaranteed, and I'll receive my $750,000 finder fee plus exclusive development consulting rights." The voice responding was unmistakably Robert Chen Jr., whose father sat on the township commission and whose company, Grandview Corporation, specialized in high-end developments. "What about the other residents? Some of them are getting suspicious about the finances." Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Let them suspect. By the time they understand where their council dues have been going, we'll be counting our profits from the Bahamas." The recording continued with details that made my prosecutorial instincts sing with anticipation. Council dues had been systematically diverted to a shell company called Highland Management Services, which existed only on paper and was owned entirely by Margaret. Emergency assessments for special projects had funded her luxury car lease, a Caribbean vacation, and renovations to her consulting office. Several residents had been double billed for services that never existed, while forged meeting minutes concealed the financial mismanagement from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. But Eleanor's research had uncovered an even more significant legal bombshell. "Ms. Walsh, I spent all night examining incorporation records at the state level," she said, her accounting training evident in the precise organization of her files. "Margaret never properly incorporated the council under Oregon law. All enforcement actions for the past 3 years are technically invalid. Every fine, every lien, every threat she'd made was legally meaningless. Residents were entitled to complete refunds of illegally collected fees totaling nearly $600,000. As a district attorney who'd specialized in white-collar crime for 25 years, I could see the criminal implications immediately. Mail fraud for using postal services to collect illegal fees, wire fraud for electronic transfers to her shell company, conspiracy charges for the development scheme with the Chens. This was exactly the type of corruption case that had built my reputation. The irony was almost poetic. Margaret Thornfield had been threatening and harassing the one district attorney whose specialty was sending people exactly like her to state prison. "There's something else," Eleanor said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I researched your background online after the commissioners' meeting. You're not just any retired prosecutor. You're the one they called the hammer for corruption cases. Margaret has been threatening a legend. The taste of justice was already sweeter than my morning coffee, but I knew rushing to prosecute would deny me something more satisfying. Instead of immediately calling my former colleagues at the Attorney General's office, I decided on poetic justice. I would allow Margaret to continue her illegal schemes, documenting every crime while she unknowingly sealed her own fate. The trap was set, and Margaret Thornfield was about to discover that some prey fights back. The following morning, I converted my garage into a command center that would have made any investigation task force proud. Evidence boards lined the walls, connected by colored string that mapped out Margaret's web of corruption like a spider's deadly design. The smell of fresh printer ink filled the air as documents produced timeline charts, financial audits, and communication logs that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning 2 years. My team assembled over the next week like characters from a legal drama, each bringing unique skills that complemented my prosecutorial experience. Eleanor Martinez became my master archivist, her accounting training perfect for organizing mountains of documentation and secretly recorded conversations. Jennifer Park brought media connections and hunger for a story that would make national headlines. Detective Ray Thompson, my late husband's former police partner, provided law enforcement insights and connections throughout the state. Carlos Rivera, a civil rights attorney specializing in housing discrimination, joined after hearing about Margaret's targeting patterns against elderly and minority residents. The most surprising addition was Sarah Kim. The local contractor Margaret had cost $50,000 through her lies and manipulation. Sarah brought intimate knowledge of the construction world, plus a personal grievance that made her extremely motivated to see justice served. Her experienced hands could read building plans like novels, and she immediately spotted irregularities in Grandview Corporation's development proposals that no one else had noticed. Carlos's legal analysis revealed something that made my blood boil. Margaret's harassment wasn't random. She'd systematically targeted elderly residents, single women, and the few minority families in our township, using different tactics for each group. The pattern suggested deliberate discrimination violating the Fair Housing Act, adding federal civil rights charges to our growing case file. Over coffee that tasted like victory, Carlos explained how we could construct a class action lawsuit that would recover stolen funds while providing substantial damages for emotional distress and civil rights violations. Sarah coordinated with a professional forensic accountant who traced the money laundering scheme through multiple shell companies and out-of-state accounts. From my years prosecuting financial crimes, I knew that electronic transfers leave digital breadcrumbs that competent prosecutors can follow blindfolded, and Margaret had been careless with her transactions. The digital trail led from council dues through Highland Management Services, then to accounts in 4 different states before finally landing in Margaret's personal investment portfolio. My former investigation colleagues helped recover deleted emails from the council server, revealing months of communication between Margaret, Robert Chen Jr., and corrupt Township Commissioner Robert Chen Sr. The conversations detailed bribes, vote buying, and plans to rezone protected land for maximum development profit. One particularly incriminating email thread discussed neutralizing the opposition by any means necessary, including the exact language that would later justify the vandalism attempt. Jennifer worked her media magic, coordinating with Portland TV stations and national property rights organizations for maximum coverage. When we revealed the full scope of corruption, she'd already arranged documentary filmmakers interested in turning our story into a feature-length expose about homeowner Abuse across America. The sound of her keyboard clicking late into the night mixed with the hum of copying machines as we prepared for what she called the biggest property, right story of the decade. But the real brilliance was in our community organizing. Eleanor had quietly reached out to exploited council members throughout the township, organizing confidential meetings in her living room, where residents shared horror stories and compared financial damages. Mr. Peterson had been fined $12,000 for his herb garden. The Rodriguez family faced foreclosure over unauthorized window boxes. Young couples with children were being driven out by impossible aesthetic standards that changed monthly. Each story added another plaintiff to our growing class action lawsuit and another witness to Margaret's systematic abuse of power. We prepared petition drives to remove Margaret from the council board, built coalitions with other townships fighting similar battles, and connected with national organizations that could provide legal support and media amplification. The taste of coordination was energizing, like conducting a symphony where every instrument played perfectly in harmony toward one inevitable crescendo. Throughout it all, I maintained my friendly facade with Margaret, allowing her to think she was still winning while she unknowingly provided more evidence with each desperate escalation. Every illegal action was documented, every threat recorded, every financial transaction traced back to its criminal source. My years in the district attorney's office had taught me that patience in building cases creates unshakable prosecutions that even the best defense attorneys cannot crack. The annual council meeting was scheduled for the following month, mandatory attendance for all residents. I planned to attend for the first time, armed with a complete evidence file that would destroy Margaret's criminal empire in front of the entire community. State prosecutors were standing by for immediate criminal referral. Media outlets were alerted to expect a major announcement, and our legal team was prepared to file both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits the moment our public confrontation concluded. The trap was perfectly set, and Margaret Thornfield was about to walk straight into it. With the annual council meeting just 4 weeks away, Margaret's desperation reached new heights. She approached me privately one evening as I was tending my garden, her luxury sedan purring in my driveway like a predator marking territory. The smell of her expensive perfume couldn't quite mask the scent of fear-induced perspiration as she stepped out carrying a manila envelope thick enough to stuff a pillow. "Kate, let's be rational adults here," she said, her voice honey-smooth but her eyes cold as winter rain. "I think there's been a misunderstanding between us." She handed me the envelope with hands that trembled slightly despite her confident facade. Inside was $150,000 in cash, crisp hundreds bundled with bank straps. "Just walk away from all this drama. Sell your property to my development partner, and everyone benefits. You'll be wealthy, the community gets improved, and we can all move forward." When I politely declined her generous offer to commit state bribery, her mask slipped completely. "Fine, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that no one will ever believe another word you say." She snatched the envelope back with enough force to tear the paper, bills scattering across my driveway like evidence of her desperation. My security system recorded our entire conversation, including her explicit threats, which would later become beautiful evidence in state court. Within hours, fake social media accounts began spreading elaborate lies about my prosecutorial record, claiming I'd been investigated for accepting bribes and fixing cases for wealthy defendants. Anonymous letters flooded the State Bar Association alleging misconduct, while harassment calls targeted my former court staff and fellow attorneys who'd worked with me for decades. The smear campaign was professionally orchestrated, but criminally stupid. Every digital attack left electronic fingerprints that my investigation friends traced back to computers at Margaret's consulting office and Grandview Corporation. Her private investigators' background check had finally revealed my true identity, sending her into full panic mode when she realized she'd been threatening a district attorney whose specialty was white-collar corruption. But while Margaret was frantically trying to destroy evidence and cover her tracks, I was quietly launching a state investigation that would make her worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. The state tax audit I'd triggered for Grandview Corporation revealed systematic tax evasion and unreported income from development kickbacks. The State Business Licensing Board received my complete evidence package, documenting Margaret's ethics violations, fraud, and illegal use of client funds. From my years prosecuting similar cases, I knew that attempting to bribe or threaten a district attorney carries a minimum 10-year state sentence, something Margaret was about to learn the hard way. Even the local bar association received an anonymous tip about Hartwell's participation in the harassment conspiracy, complete with audio recordings of him knowingly filing frivolous lawsuits. Community pressure was building like steam in a pressure cooker. Neighbors who'd been terrorized for years finally found courage to speak out, openly defying council orders and displaying "Stop Council Corruption" yard signs throughout the township. My weekend gatherings had grown to 50-plus neighbors sharing stories, comparing notes and building the kind of solidarity that Margaret's divide-and-conquer tactics couldn't break. Several council board members resigned rather than continue, participating in what they now recognized as criminal conspiracy. That's when Margaret decided to escalate to public relations warfare. She hired Sterling Communications, an aggressive PR firm specializing in crisis management for corrupt politicians and corporate scandals. Their strategy was brilliant in its audacity. Paint me as a corrupt prosecutor using legal privilege to escape property requirements while terrorizing an innocent community leader. Anonymous tips flooded the state attorney general, claiming I was a dirty prosecutor accepting bribes, while carefully orchestrated media leaks suggested I was abusing my legal connections to intimidate honest citizens. The PR campaign backfired spectacularly. State agents who investigated the corruption allegations confirmed my spotless reputation within hours, while electronic surveillance of Margaret's office revealed the full extent of her conspiracy with Robert Chen Sr., and Jr. phone surveillance caught conversations about witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and plans to flee the country if their schemes collapsed. The metallic taste of fear was evident in every recorded conversation, as Margaret's voice grew more desperate with each passing day. The surveillance recordings were comedy gold, Margaret frantically shredding documents while simultaneously trying to coordinate her defense with increasingly expensive attorneys who kept discovering new crimes with each billable hour. Her office sounded like a paper shredder convention, mixed with the nervous energy of criminals who know the walls are closing in. But the most damning evidence came from her own mouth during a recorded conversation with Robert Jr. If that prosecutor thinks she can destroy me, she's about to learn what real power looks like. I don't care if it takes burning down half the township. I will not lose to some washed-up old woman in gardening clothes. That recording would later become Exhibit A in the conspiracy to commit arson charges, proving once again that criminals never know when to stop talking. 3 weeks before the annual council meeting, Margaret's desperation hit rock bottom when she connected with Tony Russo, Sarah Kim's disgruntled former employee who'd been fired for drinking on the job and cutting safety corners. Tony was a walking disaster with enough grievances against the world to fuel a small war, making him the perfect tool for someone willing to cross the final line into violent crime. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Margaret paid Tony $15,000 in cash to stage an accidental electrical fire during the next windstorm, when emergency response would be delayed and investigators would assume natural causes. Tony's ex-girlfriend, Maria, however, had enough conscience left to secretly report the arson plot to Detective Thompson, who immediately coordinated with state and federal authorities to set up a sting operation that would catch everyone red-handed. On the appointed night, I evacuated to my son's house in Portland as a precaution, while police and fire departments positioned themselves around my property like pieces on a chessboard. Hidden cameras captured every angle of the 3-acre spread, while state agents monitored radio communications to gather evidence that would seal Margaret's fate forever. The smell of anticipation mixed with autumn air as we waited for Tony to make his move, knowing that arson for hire carries state charges with a minimum 15-year sentence when it involves interstate commerce or crosses county lines. At 3 a.m, during a planned power outage that Margaret had arranged through her utility company contacts, Tony arrived in his pickup truck loaded with professional accelerants and the kind of arrogance that comes from thinking you're smarter than law enforcement. He worked methodically, dousing the foundation and interior walls with chemicals designed to create an explosive fire that would consume evidence along with everything I'd built. The fire department allowed the controlled burn to proceed long enough to gather irrefutable evidence, watching my dream workshop disappear into flames that could be seen from miles away. The entire township watched in horror as 20 years of memories and 1 year of renovation work turned to ash and smoke. Mr. Peterson wept openly while Sarah, Kim's hands clenched into fists that could have crushed steel. The sound of sirens echoed through the valley like a funeral march, while the acrid smell of burning wood and dreams filled the night air with the scent of injustice that would burn in my memory forever. Tony was arrested before the flames died down, still reeking of accelerant and carrying receipts that traced directly back to Margaret's cash payments. He confessed faster than a guilty defendant on the witness stand, revealing not just Margaret's payment and detailed instructions, but also her backup plan to blame the fire on my unsafe pottery kiln installation. Bank records showed her $15,000 withdrawal the day before the fire, while phone records revealed 62 calls between them in the previous week as they coordinated what they thought was the perfect crime. But Margaret's biggest mistake came the next morning, when she called Channel 12 News to suggest that I had torched my own property for insurance money. "I hate to say this," she told the reporter with fake sympathy dripping from every word, "but Catherine Walsh has been acting increasingly unstable. I have evidence of her financial difficulties, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was staged to frame innocent community members while collecting insurance fraud." The interview was recorded and immediately became evidence of defamation, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Community outrage exploded like a secondary fire throughout the township. Neighbors who'd remained neutral finally understood the depths of Margaret's criminality, organizing relief funds for my losses while demanding state investigation into the entire corruption scheme. Local churches opened their doors for donations and support, while national property rights organizations descended on our small community with lawyers, media attention, and resources that turned our local fight into a national symbol of resistance against homeowner association tyranny. The state response was swift and devastating. The Oregon Attorney General's office announced a major investigation into council corruption and arson conspiracy, while state investigators raided Margaret's office, home, and consulting company with search warrants that left no stone unturned. Computers were seized, files confiscated, and safety deposit boxes opened to reveal the full scope of financial crimes spanning multiple counties. Grandview Corporation offices were sealed with yellow tape while investigators traced money laundering schemes through offshore accounts and shell companies. Township Commissioner Robert Chen Sr. was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, his political career destroyed faster than my workshop had burned. The environmental inspector Bradley Chen faced state charges for abuse of authority and conspiracy, while Attorney Hartwell found himself under investigation by both the Bar Association and state prosecutors for his role in the harassment campaign. The taste of smoke still lingered in my mouth, but underneath it was something sweeter, the satisfaction of watching a criminal conspiracy collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Margaret Thornfield had awakened a sleeping giant, and tomorrow's reckoning would be spectacular. The emergency township meeting was called for the following Thursday evening, and by 6 o'clock the community center auditorium was packed tighter than sardines in a can. Over 500 residents filled every seat while media crews set up cameras and state agents positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd. The air crackled with tension and anticipation as Mayor Williams called the meeting to order, his voice barely audible over the nervous chatter of citizens demanding answers about arson, corruption, and the systematic abuse of power that had terrorized their community. Margaret arrived fashionably late with her attorney in tow, playing the role of persecuted victim with award-worthy performance skills. She wore a conservative gray suit designed to project authority and respectability, but her eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal searching for escape routes. When she took her seat in the front row, the whispers and hostile stares from the audience made it clear that public opinion had shifted decisively against her. Entered to spontaneous applause that started with Mr. Peterson and spread through the crowd like wildfire. Neighbors who'd supported me through months of harassment stood and clapped, while others joined in, creating a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. The sound echoed off the auditorium walls like thunder, and I could see Margaret's face growing paler with each passing second as she realized how completely her support had evaporated. When Mayor Williams called me to the podium, I walked forward with the measured pace I'd used in criminal courtrooms for 2.5 decades. The room fell silent except for the clicking of camera shutters and the hum of recording equipment. I gripped the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, some friendly, some curious, all waiting for the truth that would finally set our community free. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying the authority of 25 years in the district attorney's office. "I think it's time you knew exactly who you're dealing with." The pause stretched for 5 heartbeats, building tension like a symphony conductor preparing for the crescendo. "My name is District Attorney Catherine Walsh, and I have served the state of Oregon for 25 years, specializing in corruption cases that send criminals exactly like Mrs. Thornfield to state prison." The gasp from the audience was audible, a collective intake of breath as the magnitude of Margaret's mistakes sank in. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning while reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Margaret's face went from pale to ghost white as she realized she'd been threatening and harassing a district attorney whose reputation for destroying corrupt officials was legendary throughout the legal community. I presented the timeline of harassment, corruption, and criminal conspiracy with the methodical precision of a prosecutor, laying out evidence to a jury. Audio recordings of bribery attempts and threats filled the auditorium, while financial documents projected on screen showed the systematic theft of council funds totaling nearly $600,000. Photo evidence of property tampering and vandalism appeared alongside bank records proving money laundering through shell companies that existed only on paper. "Mrs. Thornfield," I said, turning to face her directly while the cameras captured every moment. "In my 25 years as a district attorney, I have sent dozens of corrupt officials to state prison for crimes ranging from bribery and conspiracy to mail fraud and racketeering. Your arson conspiracy alone carries a 15-year state sentence. But what troubles me most is how you terrorized this entire community, targeting the elderly, minorities, and anyone who dared question your authority." I paused and addressed the packed auditorium with the full weight of my prosecutorial office behind every word. But here's what Mrs. Thornfield never understood. In America, we don't bow to petty tyrants who think a title gives them the right to destroy lives. This ends now. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. She leapt to her feet, pointing at me with a trembling finger while her voice rose to a near shriek that echoed through the stunned auditorium. "She's a corrupt prosecutor abusing her power. You're all being manipulated by a criminal who's hiding behind her legal connections." Her attorney tried desperately to quiet her, but she continued ranting like a woman possessed. "I was protecting this community from a dangerous woman who hates everything we've worked to build." The irony was perfect. A woman who'd committed dozens of state crimes screaming about law and order while security officers moved toward her position. "You're all sheep. Easily manipulated sheep who can't see that I was the only one protecting your property values." As they escorted her from the building, her voice echoing down the hallway like the wail of a defeated dictator, State Attorney General Patricia Morrison took the podium to announce a 53-count state indictment that would ensure Margaret spent the next 2 decades in state prison. The taste of justice was sweeter than mountain honey as applause thundered through the auditorium, and I realized that sometimes the system really does work when good people finally stand up to bullies. 6 months later, the legal outcomes exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Margaret Thornfield was sentenced to 18 years in state prison with no possibility of parole, plus $3.2 million in restitution to the community she'd terrorized for years. Tony Russo received 10 years for arson conspiracy, but cooperated fully with investigators, providing testimony that sealed convictions for the entire criminal network. Corrupt Township Commissioner Robert Chen Sr. received 14 years and a lifetime ban from holding public office, while his son's development company collapsed under fraud investigations. Even David Chen, the environmental nephew, received 6 years in state prison and lost his government pension for abusing his authority. The community healing process began immediately after the convictions. With help from over 70 volunteers, I rebuilt my workshop using an improved design that included a community meeting, space and resource library where neighbors could gather, without fear of council retaliation. The new structure incorporated lessons learned from the fire, better fireproofing, enhanced security systems, and solar panels that doubled. As a symbol of our community's resilience, property values actually increased throughout the township as positive media attention attracted buyers who wanted to live in a neighborhood famous for standing up to corruption. The most meaningful outcome was the Oakwood Heights Educational Foundation, established using the $600,000 in recovered council funds plus matching donations from supporters. Nationwide, the scholarship program provides college funding for local students with preference given to those pursuing careers in law, journalism, or public service. Our annual scholarship dinner has become a beloved community tradition, bringing together families who once lived in fear under Margaret's reign of terror but now celebrate the power of ordinary citizens working together for justice. My relationship with investigative reporter Jennifer Park blossomed into something neither of us expected when this nightmare began. She won a state journalism award for her series exposing homeowner association corruption statewide, while I discovered that retirement was far more enjoyable when shared with someone who appreciated both good coffee and the satisfaction of holding powerful people accountable. We married last autumn, in a ceremony held in my rebuilt community space, surrounded by neighbors who'd become family through shared struggle and ultimate triumph. The environmental initiatives we started transformed our township into a model of sustainable living. The solar cooperative reduces everyone's energy costs, while our community garden produces fresh food for the local food bank. Year-round rainwater collection systems installed throughout the neighborhood demonstrate that conservation and community development work hand in hand, creating something more beautiful than Margaret's sterile development dreams ever could have achieved. My book, When Neighbors Attack, a Prosecutor's Story, became a regional bestseller that inspired similar resistance movements in 8 states. Speaking engagements at law schools and community organizations allow me to share lessons learned about fighting corruption while building authentic community connections. The state legislature invited me to testify about homeowner association oversight legislation, and the Oregon Consumer Protection Agency created a task force to investigate systematic HOA abuse statewide. The ripple effects continue spreading far beyond our small mountain township. Oregon passed comprehensive HOA oversight legislation, requiring financial transparency, democratic governance, and criminal background checks for board members. Other states followed with similar laws, while state prosecutors now actively investigate homeowner association corruption cases that previous generations had ignored as civil matters. Most importantly, our neighborhood discovered that individual courage can inspire collective action when people realize they're not alone in their struggles. The elderly residents who once hid behind locked doors now organize potluck dinners and advocacy groups. Young families with children have created playground committees and youth sports leagues. Even former supporters of Margaret's regime have found ways to contribute positively to our community's future. Every morning when I step onto my rebuilt deck with fresh coffee and watch the sunrise paint our valley in shades of gold and possibility, I'm reminded that justice isn't just about sending criminals to prison. It's about creating communities where good people can thrive without fear of petty tyrants who mistake authority for power. Share your homeowner association horror story in the comments below. What would you have done in my situation? Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people fighting back against corruption and entitled bullies. Because your voice matters, your rights matter, and you matter more than any HOA tyrant will ever understand. Last week, I received a desperate email from a homeowner in Arizona whose association is trying to seize her property over a $75 unpaid fine. Looks like this retired prosecutor is going back to work. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Justice Served.